Hello, BookTube. I've slipped some truth serum into your vodka. No one knows where you are, and I'm fully prepared to sing the entire score of Phantom of the Opera. You will curse the day you did not do all that the Phantom asked of you. In other words, it's time for torture. Some TBR torture. I have 6 books I want to show you, 2 of which I have not read, and 4 of which I've read. So we'll go through them all. We'll start with the 2 that I haven't read and go through those together. The first one seems to me to be a monograph, which is in the loosest possible term. It seems to me to be a book-length, very specific and source-heavy study of something that is not really intending to be polished for a general audience. Monographs can be lots of fun. They can certainly be important. And this, for all I know, will be. This is by Norman Desmarais. It comes out in June. Yes, it comes out in June. And it's America's First Ally, France, in the Revolutionary War. And this is a comprehensive look at how France influenced the American Revolutionary War in a variety of ways, intellectually, financially, and militarily. It raises the crucial question of whether America could have won its independence without the aid of France. The answer to that question is absolutely not. It absolutely could not have won its independence. What would have happened if France had not intervened is that the American forces would have splintered. Most of the American leadership would have been rounded up, but there would always been people who weren't. And there would have been a prolonged guerrilla warfare on the American continent that would have, I believe, sputtered out in maybe 20 years, 30 years, 50 years at the outmost. No, without France, France fought the major battles. France broke the power of England's forces in America. American forces were on the point of losing at almost every turn. And this is, of course, France's role in the American Revolution has been studied to a fairly well, but this seems to me to be, when I was flipping through it, I noticed that, let me show you an example of what I mean here. There are many sections that are just bullet points, which is often the mark of a monograph. And there are also extremely small chapters on specific items, including a breakdown of each vessel. So I have a feeling that the author is a specialist. He's a professor emeritus at Providence College and an active reenactor. He's a member of the 2nd Rhode Island Regiment and the Brigade of the American Revolution, and he's the editor-in-chief of the Brigade Dispatch and the author of a number of titles on the Revolutionary War. Okay, well, fantastic. America's First Ally looks at the contributions of individual French officers and troops, arguing that America could not have won without them. Okay, so the author agrees with me. There's no way not to agree with that. Even if America had somehow managed to find another international ally, it had to be France in order to win. In order for there to be any hope of that, any other international ally would have complicated things, but not affected the outcome of the war. Boy, okay, fantastic. Well, the one worry that I have, I mean, I'm all for reading monographs, especially on a subject that I love as much as the American Revolution. My one worry is that monographs, because they are not polished for a general audience, can sometimes be dry. They can sometimes be a chore to read. Just a hazard of the territory. There's no way around it. The next one very much is made for a popular audience, and in this case, it could work against it. So this is by Alev Scott, and it is Ottoman Odyssey, Travels Through a Lost Empire, in which the author, who was born in 1987 to a Turkish mother and a British father and studied classics at New College, Oxford, where she was taught by Robin Lane Fox, the great historian and biographer Robin Lane Fox. She taught herself Turkish and has immersed herself in the Turkish side of her heritage and wrote the widely acclaimed Turkish Awakening, which was published by Faber in Britain. And she's reported on Turkey in a wide number of newspapers, most especially for the Financial Times. And this is her journey through the lands of and the cities of the old Ottoman Empire. Let me read you a little bit about it here. It began when she looked beyond Turkey's borders for contemporary traces of the Ottoman Empire. Their 800 years of rule ended a century ago, and yet, traveling through 12 countries from Kosovo to Greece to Palestine, Scott uncovers a legacy that's vital and relevant, where medieval ethnic diversity meets 21st century nationalism and displaced people seek new identities. And the worry that I have here, I mean, it's absolutely fascinating. And I will have been over every inch of the territory that she describes myself. The thing that worries me about it is that a gimmick like that, traveling throughout the old Ottoman Empire, when you yourself are partially descended from, the architects of the Ottoman Empire, I'm worried that it might be the way to do a subject like this is to write about the subject. This is not the way to do an autobiography at all, because the Ottoman Empire encompassed a lot of suffering, a lot of barbarity, and a lot of the people who are living in what were former Ottoman lands now are living miserable lives. This is not the occasion, in other words, for a series of literary selfies. So we will see. It sounds like this is a serious author, so that probably won't happen. It's just a little wary that a lot of these stories, I have read books like this, not particularly on this exact route or itinerary, but I've read books like this where the authors sometimes maddeningly manage to bring everything around back to themselves, and that bugs me a little. But faced by questions of exile, diaspora, and collective memory, Scott searches for answers from the cafes of Beirut to the refugee camps of Lesbos. She uncovers in modern-day Turkey the Nouveau Ottoman, a version of the nostalgic utopias sold to disillusioned voters in Europe and America. And yet, as she relates with compassion, insight, and humor, diversity is the enduring, endangered heart of this fascinating region. Okay, well, I'm all for it. This comes out in May, I believe. This comes out in early May, and I have had many interesting experiences in some of the places that she will be talking about. So that'll be fascinating. And those are the two that I have not read, and now I want to share with you. There are 4 that I have read. And they are all, in their way, recommendations. So your TBRs will be tortured just a bit if you are interested in these things. The first one is a little volume from the Library of America. They are a big, sweeping, uniform, black, dust-jacketed reprint collection of American classics. And a couple of authors who weren't American, but that's all right. They still wrote American classics. And the Library of America they're printed with acid-free pages. They have built-in bookmarks. They have sewn binding. Traditionally they have a minimal editorial imprint. The editorial vetting of the text itself is scrupulous, but usually it's a very light hand for the editorial presence. The introduction is usually very short. There are no such things as copious afterwards or interpretive essays. The works are very much allowed to stand on their own. And the Library of America has been a success. It's popular in schools. It's popular in libraries. It's popular for completists. You can get the whole collection, have just a bookcase as big as the one behind me that's full of Library of America. And a lot of the volumes are precious. A lot of the volumes they're incredibly durable, first of all. If you have a Library of America volume of the history volumes of Henry Adams or the natural writings of Bartram or Lewis and Carroll or whatever, you're never going to need to worry about them yellowing or getting brittle or anything like that. You have archival editions of those works that are really nice, really. And there's also a kind of, like with these penguins, there's a kind of mesmerizing effect to the uniform visual aspect. But because it's been a success, the Library of America has occasionally innovate. They do interesting things. They do 1 or 2 volume collections. They do themed anthologies. Their 2-volume box set of classic science fiction novels is something I really wish I had kept. I had it, and I really wish I had kept it. It is actually worth keeping. Same thing with their murder mysteries, and American maritime writing is a classic. And they've recently started doing little hardcover volumes. We saw one on this channel. We've probably seen more than one. We saw one on General Grant's letters home to his wife, just in a little Library of America volume. And this is along the same lines. This is edited by the great historian Brenda Wineapple, and it is Walt Whitman Speaks. And it's a collection of when Whitman was an old man, a young writer, a young writer named Horace Traubel visited him in New Jersey and just sat and talked with him and took down enormous amounts of notes, thousands of pages of notes of just anything that Whitman was saying. Traubel was sort of animated by the belief that Whitman was a sage for the ages, that this enormous endeavor of his would actually be justified by history. That he wasn't, in other words, doing this with Whittier. If anybody had had a similar conviction with Whittier, that conviction would have been wrong. No one knows Whittier now. No one cares what he said when he was an old man in New Jersey. Traubel was convinced that that would not happen with Walt Whitman, and he was entirely right. The American literary world venerates Walt Whitman. And this is basically his table talk, although he was in a rocker most of the time. And Traubel wrote it all down, just all of it down. And Whitman's tongue was loosened a bit. I'd be willing to bet that the only pictures of Horace Traubel that are online now are from when he was an old and very Mark Twain-esque man. He led a long and very interesting life and was well lived in. His body, his skin was well lived in by the time he shuffled off this mortal coil. And I'd be willing to bet that online that's what you'll see if you look up a picture of him. But when he was 29 years old, he was extremely attractive. And that helped to loosen Whitman's tongue. And as a result, the resulting collection of sayings and meditations and whatnot, some only a couple of sentences, others much longer, it's enormous. And volumes have come out over and over again. And well, I think that Brenda Wineapple says it herself in this book. Yeah, the fact remains that the material begs for compression. Now, I don't agree with that. It begs for a very good editorial hand with lots of annotation. It begs for her attention, or someone else, some other Whitman scholar's attention, but not necessarily huge edits. This is hugely edited, of course. It's a tiny little thing. The 9 bulky volumes of Traubel's transcriptions are cumbersome, redundant, and taxing even for the most ardent Whitman admirer. As a result, the material is neither well-known nor easily accessible. Thus, in choosing selections of what is essentially a table talk edition of Whitman's Reflections, I have followed Traubel's lead. I have decontextualized Whitman, which is to say, I excluded Traubel's voice and his occasional interruptions or asides, and more importantly, I have chosen to arrange Whitman's musings in categories familiar to the general reader, omitting commentary on local Camden weather, Camden politics, free trade, money matters, and the negotiations for his tomb in Harley Cemetery. But tell me, you tell me. I mean, I understand the editorial reasoning behind that, but you tell me, wouldn't you find that interesting? The very things she says she cut out, wouldn't you find those things interesting? I know I would. If they were properly presented and maybe lightly footnoted, I think that would be fantastic reading. There is, in other words, there is a bigger volume, a Penguin Classic, for instance, of 800 pages, that doesn't compress nearly as much and that has a stronger editorial presence than this little volume. That maybe I wouldn't call it Walt Whitman Speaks. I might call it something else. But it could easily become a modern American classic. It could easily get reviewed everywhere and take on like wildfire. A book like that does not, to my knowledge, exist. She's right that the Traubel volumes are a chore to read. But that's as much of the editor's fault as it is his fault. And certainly none of it is Whitman's fault. Old people have a tendency to ramble profundities. Whitman might have had a YouTube channel. But in the meantime, until such a volume happens, this is amazing. I don't agree with the artificiality of those modern ideas on women, on freedom of speech, stuff like that. I think it imposes a didacticism on these sessions that wasn't present. That wasn't present. That was not a characterization of the conversations that these two men had, and those conversations were very accurately conveyed in the notes that Traubel took. So this, in a way, does violence to those notes and to these conversations, which are a treasure trove. I mean, imagine how wonderful it would be to have this same thing, 5,000 pages of notes of Herman Melville rambling at the end of his life on every subject under the sun, or Nathaniel Hawthorne, or Emily Dickinson, for God's sake. Imagine how wonderful that would be. So it is an amazing thing. I'm very happy to see it in a nice, handy hardcover from Library of America. This comes out, I think, in May. Yeah, this comes out in late May, so this will be in your bookstores in June. And I do recommend it. It's a side of Whitman that, unless you have boned up on his biographies, you won't know, and it's fascinating. Uh, it's recommended, but it's recommended with a slight caveat in that I recommend this book, but I also recommend it as a bookmark for a better volume. I would still want Brenda Wineapple to be involved, but a better volume, a much bigger volume. Take a stern hand editorially with the material, but don't decontextualize it. Don't decontextualize it. Don't do that. It was a partial dialogue between two men. It was a man and a chorus. You have to preserve that. And it's worthwhile to preserve it. If you do that at 800 pages, it will be mesmerizing for the reader. I trust that will happen someday. I will tell you all about it on this channel. Then we'll go on to the next one that I want to recommend. This is a full-blown work of academic scholarship, which will cause a certain percentage of you to head for the Titanic's lifeboats right away. Anyway, and I understand that not everybody wants to read academic scholarship, but this is a self-evidently important subject, and this is a groundbreaking work. Nothing on this subject written in English has ever come close to the value of this book. It is by M. Taylor Fravel, and it's called Active Defense: China's Military Strategy Since 1949. And that's what it is. And this author consults a huge, the endnotes on this book, they're in micro type and they're like 80 pages long. He consults a huge array of sources, including lots of Chinese sources that as far as I know, no Western scholar has ever consulted before. And this is from Princeton University Press, a big, well-endowed academic press, so this will be in bookstores. And they, of course, will have this book in every library. It's well worth your time if this subject interests you. Let me read you a little bit about it here. Since the 1949 Communist Revolution, China has devised 9 different military strategies, which the People's Liberation Army calls strategic guidelines. What accounts for these numerous changes? This book offers the first systematic look at China's military strategy from the mid-20th century to today. Exploring the range and intensity of the threats that China has faced, the author illuminates the nation's past and present military goals and how China sought to achieve them, and offers a rich set of cases for deepening the study of a change in military organizations. Sounds a bit on the dry side because this is it's a bit of a dry subject. You have to be interested in it. This comes out, did I mention already? It comes out in late April. And I mean, it is a bit on the dry side. Once again, we are talking about what is essentially an extended monograph. But this author pays a lot more attention to readability. It's a smoothly readable book, which academic treatises usually are not. And I thought it was in every chapter I was reading things that I had never encountered before, never even suspected before, mainly because of all the primary source research that this author has done. So it gets a thumbs up. I recommend it. Then the next one, also a work of history. It's very, very interesting. I don't know if we saw this on this channel before. It's by David K. Randall, and it's called Black Death at the Golden Gate: The Race to Save America from the Bubonic Plague. This is about, well, let me read you. This is about the time that America almost succumbed to the Black Death itself. For Chinese immigrant Wong Chut King, surviving in San Francisco meant a life in the shadows. His death on March 6, 1900 would have been unremarkable if a city health officer hadn't noticed a swollen black lymph node on his groin, a sign of bubonic plague. Empowered by racist pseudoscience, officials rushed to quarantine Chinatown while doctors examined Wong's tissue for telltale bacteria. If the devastating disease was not contained, San Francisco would become the American epicenter of an outbreak that had already claimed 10 million lives worldwide. To local press, railroad barons, and elected officials, such a possibility was inconceivable or inconvenient. As they mounted a cover-up to obscure the threat, ending the career of one of the most brilliant scientists in the nation in the process, it fell to federal health officer Rupert Blue to save a city that refused to be rescued. And this is that story. It's we've got a narrow focus of people, a small coterie of people working against public pressure, against official pressure, against the current racial ideas of the day, against everything, to try and stop this extremely communicative disease from rushing out of control in the heart of an American metropolis. And this author has done a huge amount of research to give you not just the full story of that outbreak, but also the larger idea of what America was like at the time. so that you know what these people were working against. There's a great quote in here. I want to give it to you. Sanitation remained a relatively new concept in the United States, whereas recently as 1850, Frederick Law Olmsted, known chiefly as the co-designer of New York's Central Park, had toured the country to highlight everyday acts of filthiness for which he deemed barbarous too mild a term. In Virginia hotels, he wrote, "Every clean towel I got during my stay was a matter of special negotiation." In Mississippi, the hotel bed he was offered was, quote, "furnished with soiled sheets and greasy pillows." A request for drinking water in Texas resulted in a field hand smashing ice hanging from the side of a building with his hand and pouring the mixture of dirt, water, and grime into a mud street glass. And those are great evocative details, but I think you'll know if you read as much nonfiction, as much history as I do, great evocative details will only take you so far if the author doesn't know what he's doing. That is well written in addition to being well chosen, and the whole book is like that. It's just an amazing what-if story that is long on personality, long on regional fights, but also keeps an eye on the wider picture. Really effectively keeps an eye on the wider picture of what we think about epic diseases and who's responsible for them and how they spread and how social ideas can get in the way of saving our own lives. I read this right hand in hand with a new book that I think we saw on this channel called Pandemic Century, which is also fascinating and which is largely about a lot of the same subjects. I'll bring it up in another TBR Torture session. But I want to recommend this one. This is fairly short and very evocative, very entertaining history reading. And the last one I want to read, the last one I want to show you here, I'll also read a section from it. We saw it on this channel. I got a finished copy. I reread it. I read the first one because this is my history. This is stuff that I know all of the players, big and small. I know everything that happened. I was living this day by day, reading the papers morning and night, writing editorials. This is my history, a lot of it, so I feel invested. And it's this thing. It's by James Gans, and it's White House Warriors. And the subtitle is How the National Security Council Transformed the American Way of Life. And I'm wondering if the history buffs in the audience can pick out the identities of any of those men. One of them will be fairly easy, but there's another one who also looms large in American history who's in this picture. But anyway, this is about all of the it's about modern. Well, let me read you this. Since its founding more than 70 years ago, the National Security Council has extended more influence on presidential foreign policy. This is gold lettering on gold backdrop. Foreign policy decisions and on the nation's conflicts abroad than any other institution or individual. And yet, until the explosive Trump presidency, few Americans could name even one member. When Congress originally created the National Security Council in 1947, it was intended to better coordinate foreign policy after World War II. Nearly an afterthought, a small administrative staff was established to help keep its papers moving. President John F. Kennedy was, as the author of this book documents, the first to make the NSC staff his own, selectively hiring bright young aides to do his bidding during the disastrous Bay of Pigs operation and fraught Cuban Missile Crisis and the deepening Vietnam War. Despite Kennedy's death and the tragic outcome of some of his decisions, the NSC staff endured. President Nixon handed the staff's reins solely to Henry Kissinger, who, given his controlling instincts, micromanaged its work on Vietnam. In the 1980s, President Ronald Reagan's NSC was cast into turmoil by the overreaching staff members who, led by Oliver North, nearly brought down a presidency in the Iran-Contra scandal. And later, when President George W. Bush's administration was bitterly divided on the Iraq War, his NSC staff stepped forward to write a plan for the surge in Iraq. So this covers modern history. This departmental think tank in the OEOB that just... Some of its members are famous, most of them are not, and the author has, that would be interesting anyway, a history of that would be interesting anyway, but this author has a wonderful way with narrative history. You just fly through this book, if it interests you. I don't know that you would fly through this book if you're coming at it cold, but if you're interested in this sort of thing, this is quite the book. I want to read you a bit, just to give you a sense of, give you a sense of the author's narrative ability. I turned down a section here because I'm going to be reviewing this thing at some point for somebody. I'm going to be reviewing this. And this is about Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait and the the possibility of what that meant to the West, because the George H.W. Bush administration had been very stern with Hussein and very stern with his obvious threats. And let's see here, the NSC is debating it in a 5-hour session. Haas, Haass. He was a diplomat, State Department guy, a really good brain. He appears in this book quite a bit. And the rest of the deputies tried to interpret murky and conflicting intelligence. In the end, according to the NSC staffer, they concluded, quote, whatever it was, we didn't like it much, and recommended that Bush make a last attempt to dissuade Hussein from invading. Haas recalls thinking of it as a long shot, but he returned to the White House and tried to sell the plan to Brent Scowcroft, who we've met on this channel a couple of times. He was the presiding genius of foreign policy in the Bush administration, much though Henry Kissinger hated that. With the National Security Advisor's agreement, he and Haas went to visit the president. They found Bush on the examination table in the White House medical unit. The president was wearing a T-shirt and getting a heat treatment for a shoulder sore from hitting golf balls earlier in the evening. As the three discussed just how a telephone call could be made, quote, it wasn't as if we had the phone number for the Iraqi leader. Haas explained later, another message came from the State Department and informed them, quote, we just heard from our people in Kuwait, shooting has started. Bush told Scowcroft and Haas, I guess we're going to have a war. That reads like a novel. I mean, I don't mean to denigrate it because novels often read poorly, but that kind of smooth narrative flow is maintained throughout as the author has to surf from administration to administration, from personality to personality. It's not easy to do, and he manages it without ever, as far as I know, dropping the ball. I was captivated from beginning to end, even when I disagreed with some of his characterizations of some of the people involved. Although this is a fairly neutral book. And the personalities come through anyway, no matter what you think about the verdict of history. I love, for instance, there's a moment later on in the book where Condoleezza Rice sort of feels a little wistful when she returns to the NSC after a long stint there and then a long absence. She returns and finds that it's not any longer the little body of people that was described in that jacket copy, that it's become far more institutionalized, far more staffed, far bigger and less personal. That was neat. That was a neat feeling. Something that would never have occurred to me before this book. That would never have occurred to me to think in those terms about any of this. And it helps to explain some of the thinking, some of the philosophy, if you would, of the NSC. So, a wonderful, wonderful book. So there you go. That is a little TBR Torture for this Thursday. Is this Thursday TBR Torture? So we have White House Warriors, about the National Security Council. Then we have Black Death at the Golden Gate, about the time when the bubonic plague almost struck America. Then we have Active Defense, scholarly work, yes, but a scholarly work of analysis on modern Chinese military history, post-World War II Chinese military history. A subject that would have been a black box for even the most enterprising scholars even 30 years ago. And here we have a really bush-clearing book on the subject. Then Walt Whitman Speaks, a short recension of the Traubeil transcripts that's come out by the Library of America. Bless them for always innovating. This will be, for the vast majority of the audience, this will be a Walt Whitman that they have not met before. Most people know Whitman because they encounter his poetry at school a little, but they don't ever read any biographies of him, and they certainly have never read any of these books. This is a wise step on Library of America's part to try and make them a little bit better known in an attractive volume. And then we have two that I will report back on. We have Alev Scott writing about Ottoman Odyssey, where she travels throughout some of the former lands of the Ottoman Empire, and also America's First Ally, a fairly detailed study of who exactly constituted France's help of America during the American Revolution. Which ships, which officers, which people, and what they did, and exactly where they were and what they said. So maybe a little granular for most history readers. I will report back. It could be that it's too granular even for me. But one way or another, I'm intrigued, and either way, the work itself will be important. even if the polish for general audience is not there. So there you go. That's a little TBR torture for you. I'll wrap this up now. But I will be back. Thank you, BookTube.